Today on the Take On Board podcast, I'm speaking with Linh Do about the Take On Board Accelerator program. This is a program that I run, and many of you will know that earlier this year I did a mini-series on the podcast about professional development options and forgot to do my own professional development option. So that's what we're talking about today instead of doing it back then. Before we start the conversation today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record. For me, I am on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also pay my respects to any First Nations people who may be listening today. I acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters, skies, culture and country. I support Voice, Treaty and Truth for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and I encourage others in the Take On Board community to do the same. Now, let me tell you about Linh. Linh is the chair of the Climate Action Network Australia and AktivAsia and a board member of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. She's also a research committee member at the Centre for Policy Development. She was formerly on the boards of the Centre for Sustainability Leadership, where I think we met. I think that's how we first met. No. Oh, my goodness. Okay, we'll come back to that. All right, then. So she was formerly on the boards of the Centre for Sustainability Leadership, because I was on the board there as well, although I know not at the same time, and Our Say, and she's been on a range of government advisory groups. Linh has a background in climate advocacy, in leadership, and she is currently the director of the Wattle Fellowship at the University of Melbourne. Linh, welcome to the Take On Board podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. Two fun facts for listeners right away. I think we actually first met through the Board Accelerator program. Like, I'd heard of your name beforehand, but I think when I first did the Board Accelerator program, I want to say back in 2018-19 was actually when we first met. Yes, so fun fact, we'll get to delve into history and recent history. But the other one is that recently the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation recently renamed to the Greater Melbourne Foundation, which is a whole governance journey and maybe a future podcast ep. What happens when the board, the organisation you're on the board of, wants or needs to rename.
Oh, my God, I would love to have that conversation because it is something that happens quite regularly. But yes, and I love it, the Greater Melbourne. We're definitely not the Lesser Melbourne Foundation. It is the Greater Melbourne Foundation. Loving it. Excellent. All right. Well, they are excellent updates. And yeah, like I say, I was sure it was through the Centre for Sustainability Leadership, but that's what happens when you've been hanging around each other's worlds for a while. You know, it all blurs. Now, speaking of, backgrounds, I would love to dig a little bit deeper about you. So can you tell me a story about young Linh that tells us a bit about how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so even as the occasional listener of the podcast, this question still will always throw me. It's always like, oh no, so many childhood memories to pick from. But the one that immediately springs to mind, I'm not going to lie, doesn't paint me in the best light, but it takes me back into probably like kindergarten or prep, was outside playing in the sandpit, as you do. And I remember this very vividly because we were making sandcastles. And this other person, obviously of the same age that I would have been at the time, 4 or 5, knocks over the sandcastle that my friend was making. I was obviously outraged and horrified and proceeded to take action because, you need to stand up to injustice, which obviously at the time I didn't have the word for that. But the way that I chose to stand up for injustice at that time was fill a bucket full of sand and then dump it on to this poor kid's head. Obviously at the time I felt very vindicated and I felt like justice had been served, and probably was taking a lot out of the notion of an eye for an eye. Obviously since then I would say that my understanding of how one achieves justice has become a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more polite, and probably a little bit more socially acceptable. But that probably for me is like one I think about a lot in terms of when people ask, how do you know if something is right or wrong? You know something is right or wrong, even if it's not from like an intellectual perspective, even if you don't necessarily have the language for it.
Yeah.
When you see something that happens in the world that you disagree with or you think isn't right or doesn't align with your values, you have a gut feeling and you respond to it. And I think whether that's through the work that people do, being on boards, whatever else, we learn how to respond to these injustices with, hopefully a little bit more strategy, a little bit more consideration of risk and all of those good things. But that, I think, is a story that, for me, always harks back to my earliest instance of when I saw injustice in the world and chose to do something about it.
Oh, I love that story, Lynn. I am imagining young Lynn and, in the board context, I would hope that the boardroom doesn't always feel like the sandpit and doesn't feel like if something goes wrong, somebody's going to tip a bucket of water on your head. Although, let's face it, that is sometimes what happens, metaphorically. So, yeah, that is great to hear. I love, yeah. So you've always stood up for justice. That does not surprise me one iota. Lovely. All right. Well, thank you. There you go. You've heard that question so often on the podcast, and now you've had it for yourself. Let's dive on into the conversation then, shall we? So, as I say, this feels a little bit meta for me because we're talking about my program. The program that I designed, it is definitely not my program in a way because, as I'm sure we'll touch on, the power of this program comes from the group. So I thought I would just share a little bit about what people can expect if they are doing the program. And then I'm just going to ask you loads of questions about how it all works and what your experience of it was like, if that's okay.
Sounds great.
Excellent. So, folks, as I said at the top of the episode, I did a mini-series earlier this year about different professional development options for people in the boardroom. And the Take On Board Accelerator program is one of those options. So this is run as it's a very practical focus. It runs over 12 months, so over a calendar year. We kick off in February, we finish in December, and it's a small group program. For me, I'm sure people have heard me say this before, creating the Take On Board community was a way of bringing together like-minded people to be a cheer squad, to be a support group, and to be a brains trust for each other. So that's why I do it as a group, small group program. So you'd be in a group, if people were thinking of doing it, you would be in a small group, normally around 10 people, women and non-binary people, to, as I say, support each other on building your governance wisdom. So, 12 months, 11 sessions, small group program. One of the things we now do, this is a relatively new thing, it wouldn't have been in your first iteration of the program, Lynn, but the psychological safety tool called Team Excel. So we use that tool to look at team dynamics and to give people an experience of this measuring psychological safety. So that's one thing that's built into the program now. As I said, we meet once a month. It's over Zoom, an hour and 45 minutes. Depending on what time, there's a different day or different time. And we look at different topics each month, much like a community of practice. So there's a whole range of topics. I'll talk about them in a moment. The other thing that's built into the program is that each month you need to have a one-on-one coffee with somebody else from the group or tea, as the case may be. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I know that that's what most other people are. So it's an opportunity to catch up one-on-one with other people in the program as well. And that just builds those connections and the learning and the safety to talk about some fairly vulnerable things in the group. Have I forgotten anything, Lynn? That feels like the overview.
No, that feels super comprehensive. Maybe we also do resource sharing as well, which requires a little bit of homework. So yeah, maybe there's that to mention.
Great. I'll look at you anticipating where I was going to go next. I love your work. So, folks, what we do, as I said, we do a different topic each month. And some of the topics that were in Lynn's group this year, everything from governance calendars to psychological safety to sustainable funding models, board communication styles, chair-CEO relationships, developing a board portfolio, all sorts of different topics. So each month the group comes along, they share something at their board that's going well in relation to whatever the topic is. They share a resource, as Lynn has just said, and then somebody brings a challenge to the table. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So maybe just those first two parts, Lynn. Well, first up, the topics. How did you find the range of topics and what stood out for you in that?
I think for me, what's really awesome about the Accelerator program is that it's so co-designed by everyone else that's doing it, and you don't know who's going to be in the cohort. And one of the things that I find really useful at the start, given how small some communities can sometimes be, is that, Halia, you do a bit of a check just to make sure that actually you don't have any conflicts. Well, conflict of interest is probably the wrong word there, but maybe overlapping circles of
Yes.
social or board or whatever else. Because, of course, it's hard to bring up a challenge that you're having in your board that's real if someone else is
Yes.
there from exactly the same board or a sister organization or a competitor organization. But as a result, you sort of don't really know who's coming into the program, but you know that there'll be people that have governance problems that may or may not be at all similar to your own. But yeah, I really love that in the first meeting or so, we essentially like surface all of the topics that are on people's minds around governance for the year, which I guess is quite different to other professional development things where you get given this is the curriculum, these are the set of things that we're going through. And I guess the reason why I love this approach and why I do think that it's both like a really broad range of topics that we're exploring, but it's also very specific because, whatever it is we're discussing is actually a real life issue for one person in that group at that moment in time. And whatever the discussion happens to be, whatever the resources happen to be, will directly be useful for them and learning opportunities for everyone else. So for me, I actually really love that process in determining what we end up talking about.
Yeah, we do. We put together that shopping list, as I always call it, the shopping list of topics in the first session, and then refine as we go, because sometimes different challenges come up for people as we go. So we use it as a resource, but then if somebody has something new that's come up, that's where we go if that's what's needed.
Yeah, and I think the question that you often ask at the end of most month sessions, Helia, is, on the schedule, what we have coming up is blah. But if anyone has like a burning challenge, crisis, or situation that they want to deal with, feel free to put up your hand and get in front of the line. And I guess for most of us, governance obligations aren't necessarily always day to day, which means that most of us have, I think, a pretty good sense of, these are the things coming up in the next 3 months. This is a thing I know might actually become an issue. I know I have like a board accelerator catch up, then maybe I almost strategically like offer to put my hand up at a certain point in time to be able to have a conversation before, the actual governance sort of meeting. But I also think a couple of people in my accelerator group this year did that in the reverse. So they used their time with the accelerator group to almost like debrief, like, here's what happened, here's what I think I did. Now I'm wondering what it is I could have done next time.
That's true. So it could be before, during, or after for a challenge. And how did you find? So the process, the process we use, folks, each month is, as I say, we share experiences, we share resources, and then we do what's called the peer review process. So it's quite a structured process where the case presenter, the person who has the challenge, presents their challenge for 5 minutes. The group then gets to ask questions, and as I always prompt, curious questions, not solving the challenge there and then. Then the person who's presenting the challenge actually, inverted commas, steps away from the table. So we're on Zoom, so they put themselves on mute, they put their camera off, and they just listen in while the group, in the nicest possible way, talks about their challenge and them, and they're rolling it behind their back. So they're not part of that conversation. So the group talks about it for 10 or 15 minutes. Then the last 5 minutes of that is suggestions for action. Then the case presenter comes back, gives their initial reflections. Then there's a strengths round. So everyone reflects on a strength that they have observed in the case presenter, progressing their challenge thus far. So how did you find that process? How did you find the peer review process, both as a case presenter and as a participant? What stood out for you there?
We obviously spend so much time talking, and in some ways that's what people on boards do, is like a lot of talking. So I actually found it really different and like a good sort of challenge to my brain to have real structure to how we were talking. And by that, I don't mean here's an agenda and we know that we'll be covering topics A, B, C, but almost more structured in that at this stage, these are the types of questions to ask. At this stage, these are the types of things to be prompting. I think for me, that actually really helped me break down someone else's problem, really understand it, rather than hear what I think I thought they said, rather than actually the words that they were saying, and then being like, okay, well, obviously the solution is A, B, C, but instead understanding what is actually going on there. Why does it matter to this person? In many ways, even though it's a group process, I think it uses a lot of like coaching tools, which is term. For me, one of the highlights of that model, though, is actually listening to everyone else's questions. One of the things that I sometimes do is I spend a lot of time on Reddit because you can just sort of read what people anonymously are thinking on the internet. And so often I'll be reading things and going, wow, I really didn't realize that this would be the set of responses that people would have in their reasonings why. And I think anytime a case presenter, so, someone else in the group talks through what their problem is, my first question might be, tell me more about like the people dynamics, but someone else in the group might ask something completely different to that. And I always, I guess, like pause for a moment to wonder what would have happened if, this was just a one-on-one conversation that I was having with anyone else. And I asked that question first instead of my question, or like, what is it that they're hearing that I'm not hearing? So for me, hearing other people's questions has been, super useful for me to get that breadth of diversity. So that's been awesome. And I think when I first came into the program, so this was like my first time many years ago now, I did wonder, well, what happens if I'm not interested in the topic, or what happens if I don't think it's relevant, or what happens if I don't think I have anything to contribute? But two things really helped me with that. One is just like the human empathy of knowing that this is a real problem for someone. And I've always loved in your little intro to the podcast, governance work can be really lonely. And these are people who've chosen to try to find community, to try to find help and guidance. So even if you're like personally not super interested or professionally like have much to bring, you can be, well, this is a real human in front of me asking for help. The minimum I can do is listen, and like, anything else is sort of a benefit on that. That's one that's been really helpful. But then the second as well is, like any good board, it's a really diverse group of people who do the board accelerator program. So even if my role sometimes in some of the cases that get presented is to ask the really dumb questions, to really like help whoever it is or the group sort of zoom out, then that's still super valuable. And I think it's a really level playing field, regardless of if for some people it's their first time on a board and that's why they're doing the accelerator program. For others, they already have a board portfolio career that they've, been building for many years. But yeah, that general curiosity, I think, means that model works really well in generating conversation and useful insight.
Oh, well, I'm partly relieved to hear that, because that's exactly, my view in designing the program. The two things that you've touched on there. One is that diverse groups make better decisions, and I really aim for these groups to be diverse as well. And secondly, that even if it's not your topic, generally what I hear is that people learn from it regardless. So the case presenter generally definitely gets progress on whatever their challenge might be. The group also learns, whether it's from just inverted commas, different questions to ask and different learning, or whether it's like, actually, I've been through that, I'm going through that, I might go through that in the future. So this gives me some ideas about how to handle it when it comes to me as well. Yeah.
And that happened to me this year. Like, I think our very first session in March was with Deb, and the question that she asked, was a whole bunch of different things. Won't go into it. That's part of the confidentiality rules. See, was listening and paying attention. But one of the things that I really took away from that session was some comments and questions were asked around different seasons of being on a board, what it looks like when you're in your first year or even first term of being on a board, what it looks like maybe when you take on some additional roles on the board, whether that's, a subcommittee chair, the chair, treasurer, whatever else. But then what it looks like when you know that potentially like the maximum of your term limits is about to come up and you have 3 years and counting, 2 years and counting. And what are some of the decisions that you might make then, or the ways in which you contribute or intervene might be different. And that was at the very, very start of this year. And at the time, I think I just like took it on and I was like, that's a cute concept. What do you know? But as we near AGM season, I've been doing a lot of succession planning and thinking about, different board recruitment things, but also then as a result, reflecting on the different boards I'm on. What season am I at for those boards? Does it make sense to stand for another term? Does it not? If I did, what would I be looking to do? So that, I think, for me was like a really great example of, I didn't think it was relevant to me like 10 months ago. And then, fast forward 9-10 months and all of a sudden, very, very relevant.
Yeah, interesting. Yes. And I find that does come up for a lot of people in some ways. It's like, that wasn't my challenge, but I've taken something from it. Yeah, interesting. Okay. What about the coffee catch-ups? I mentioned that in the start. Each month there's a coffee roster and you're allocated somebody to have a coffee with. How did you go there?
I feel like this is a really great time to admit on the record that I am behind in my catch-ups. I feel like I was diligent and reached out to everyone, but wasn't actually always able to respond. And as like timings got shorter and shorter, I was like, ugh. But my plan for all of my fellow Board Accelerator members listening is, January 2026, what a great way to reconnect with people from 2025. Look out for my email. But in all seriousness, I did still manage to make a handful. So I want to say a third, to not be too generous and self-mark my own homework. And for me, actually, what's really nice about that is it actually really does remind me of a boardroom where sometimes you come together in a boardroom and you get to know
Yes.
all of these people in a very specific context and role, but you actually don't know who they are. Obviously, you've got their CV, you have a sense of like why they're on the board, but you don't really know who they are, what other challenges they might be dealing with life outside of that governance realm, and effectively like who they are as people. And I make it a big effort on the boards I'm on to, have one-on-one, catch-ups from people at different cadences, even if I'm not the board chair, just because it's a nice way of getting to know people.
Yeah.
I also think it's a lot easier to disagree with someone in a governance context when you loosely have a sense of who they are as people. So for me, those catch-up moments were always really great because it meant I could either delve into how they were going with their challenge, like if they'd had any updates, if it was still useful for them to talk about it with someone who, isn't a friend, isn't a fellow board colleague, but has some of that context. Sometimes the conversation would just end up being about completely random, not relevant things. I think that's also part of it is it's not that bit of the program isn't structured, so you really could have your conversation about anything. But it's also a really useful way of getting to meet other people who are interested in governance roles. We know statistically that, these roles aren't really shared around. There's a bit of a quote unquote old boys club that, recently with the ASX has become a very, very small group of like women's club. And people are always asking that question of, oh, well, I don't know where I find good board directors. And I think knowing other people who are in governance roles, but outside of your sector and outside of your space is a really good way of actually ensuring, again, it's clearly AGM season for me, like ensuring that you're doing that diversity of outreach. So for me, that's been really, really nice to get to meet other people.
Awesome. Oh, it brings me to two different parts. I don't know what I'm going to ask it next, Lynn, so I'm just going to get you to choose. So what that prompted for me was part of the coffee catch-ups is to actually, it's interesting. I've had the coffee catch-ups in the program for years and then more recently put the psychological safety measurement tool in. And unsurprisingly, connection, that sort of connection that you're talking about, builds psychological safety. So it's been interesting that something that I put in just because I thought it sounded like a good idea has actually, I think, built the psychological safety. So I'll be interested in your reflections about the psychological safety broadly, but also about the tool that we did this year, if you were there for that session. The other thing it prompted for me was the other thing that people get when they become part of the program is you join the alumni, and every year there is a dinner for the alumni. So I'm not sure which one to ask you. Lynn, where should we go next?
Oh, well, I didn't make the psychological safety one, so maybe let's go to the alumni one then.
Right.
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's go there. All right. So, the alumni dinner. The alumni dinner happens each year as well. It's the one and only opportunity, actually, for the alumni, and that is anybody who has done either the Take On Board Kickstarter or Take On Board Accelerator program to come together in person. It was just held a couple of weeks ago now. You were at this year's one, weren't you?
No, unfortunately not. It was my brother's birthday, so it's on the wish list for the one day dinner.
Next year we'll get you. Okay, well there you go. I've probably talked enough about what that was anyway. People know it's the bringing together of I think the alumni, I should know this, 200 or 300 people now in the alumni. So it is not everybody comes to the dinner, as you've just heard from Lynn. Not everybody can come outrageously. Sometimes there's family events on that prevent them. But it is a gathering normally of about 50 or 60 people. And it's interesting at that dinner, I think it's interesting. People invariably sit with the people they did the group with, but halfway through the dinner, I make people swap tables so they get to meet some other people as well. And it is always fascinating, the different connections within the room, even outside the program as well.
I'm so glad to know that when I make the dinner in the future, to be prepared to not get too comfortable with where I'm sitting.
Exactly. The 2026 program has just opened. And so what would you say to people that are thinking about doing it?
So often when we think about professional development, we think about what are the things I need to learn, what are the areas where I have deficiencies and, gaps, and therefore I should do like a finance for nonprofit. Clearly that's on my list of things for next year. But, that's how we often look at it. And I guess I'd encourage anyone that's either thinking or not even thinking about this right now is that the accelerator isn't really a program in the traditional capital P version of a program, which also means that I think if you chose to do it at any point in your governance journey or life, you'll find utility from it. And the fact that it's sort of this monthly cadence that you get really familiar with, that you get to have for the entire year, makes it a really great sounding board. It's not something that you sort of dip in and dip out of, for example, like this podcast, but it's something that is a consistent part of your life. You know that it's there. You know that, one, you can both contribute to it, but two, you can also have the group of people there help you make a little bit of meaning out of the different governance challenges or even opportunities that you have as well. So it's quite a different entry point, I think, compared to most programs. But as a result, I think it is a really useful thing to think about doing maybe alongside something that's a little bit more like formal training, because it helps make it real, because you're not just learning theory. And, it's not like at the start anyone presents, best practice 101 in this topic. People are just coming in with, well, actually, this is like the really real problem that I have. What do I actually do to navigate this? Like, I've read some of the theory, you've read some of the theory, but now we're in it. And like the real situation is very rarely like a perfect case study. So I think anyone that is interested in really practical responses to the things that we learn about in textbooks, I think the accelerator might be for you.
Love it. Hope that it is. And I think you touched on it there as well, but I'll just reiterate that the group, my aim is to have diversity in the group in all of its forms. So that might be people who are newer to the boardroom, people who are more experienced in the boardroom, people who are in a range of sectors. It might be the not-for-profit sector or government or the private sector in whatever way that shows up, and a range of skills as well. So there's often a real mix in there. My advice to new board members is the same as my advice to newer people within this group, is that sometimes new people see things differently. So don't think that just because you're less experienced that somehow you're going to add or not add as much value to the group. I'm always fascinated that people who've been around boards for a long time often get quite a lot of value and wisdom from those that are newer to the boardroom. And I think that mix is really what helps that to happen.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think when I first did the accelerator program, I was earlier on in my journey and probably like really keen to like do all of the sponge soaking, and definitely had that question of what is it that I can contribute? What is it that, I could do or say that might be useful to others? But it becomes really quickly apparent that your years of experience isn't what matters. It is that willingness to listen, to offer back feedback, to offer back advice, to offer back other questions that might help that person in their journey. So it was like actually just a really lovely time.
Oh, love it. What are the main points you want people to take away from the conversation that we've had today?
The conversations are really important to solving governance challenges. And sometimes you need to have that conversation outside of your own governance context, but not just with, your friends or your neighbors or, whoever on the bus. So I think that is definitely key takeaway. And there's not a lot of other places where you can do that in life. And the other thing that I actually really value, which I didn't touch upon so much, is with every session, we come up with our own resources. So again, it's not that Halia provides us with a reading list of, 101, here are all the things you need to know. But instead, with each of the topics, we're encouraged to go away and think about what resources we've either already know or don't know about, and sort of find something that we think is useful to contribute to the group. Halia and her team do a really awesome job of collating like the mishmash of like links, YouTube videos, books, and like podcast episodes and everything else into a bit of a list that gets shared with us, which also then means that years on, you can still go back and be, wait, on that topic that wasn't at the time super useful to me, so I didn't look into all of the resources. What were the resources that people shared and why did they think it was useful then? So that's another like quite tangible takeaway, I guess, for people that really like learning in a more structured way. You get to have the conversation, but then you get that follow-up list of resources as well.
Yes. In fact, at the end of the year, you get one document, which is all of the follow-up emails from each session. So it's the full library of resources for the full year. Yeah. In fact, you've reminded me of one thing we haven't touched on. Each group has a private Signal group. So Signal, for those that don't use it, just like WhatsApp, but not owned by Zuckerberg, so therefore we prefer it. That is just, there's one for each group. And what I find fascinating is throughout the year, obviously people use it and share things and so on. But what I find really interesting is years later, often people use it. A group from 3 years ago or something, somebody will go, oh, I just wanted to check something. And all of a sudden a conversation will spark years after the case as well, which I just find fascinating. Yeah.
And it's also, again, like when I talked about people that are interested in meeting other people who have governance roles, that's a really great group for if you're ever recruiting for your board, to be sharing, to ask people for recommendations, to ask people for a bit of help. And there's nothing like, I guess, building that rapport with people who you know will give you honest feedback, who have experienced similar challenges, to be able to go back to them and ask for help. Yeah, so I think that Signal group, it's a really lovely one that also I think remains active even after the program finishes.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. You are a superstar. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with the Take On Board community today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that others will too. So thank you.
You're welcome.